The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Grace Henderson stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down her newly purchased cream-colored dress. At 42, she never thought she'd be trying on wedding dresses again, yet here she was, a smile playing on her lips as she imagined her upcoming wedding day. Her life had taken an unexpected turn 6 months ago when Robert Wilson walked into her real estate office looking for a new home. "Mom, have you seen my blue notebook?" called out her teenage daughter Lily from down the hall, breaking Grace's moment of reflection. Lily, at 17, was the spitting image of Grace in her younger years, same warm brown eyes and determined spirit. Though lately, those eyes had carried a hint of worry that Grace couldn't quite understand. Life hadn't been easy for them after Grace's first husband passed away 5 years ago. She'd thrown herself into her work as a real estate agent, making sure Lily never felt the weight of their financial struggles. They developed a tight bond, the kind that only comes from facing life's challenges together. But things were different now, better, easier, or at least that's what Grace kept telling herself. Robert had swept into their lives like a breath of fresh air. He was everything Grace thought she'd never find again: successful, charming, and seemingly devoted to both Per and Lily. As a property developer with an impressive portfolio of luxury developments across the state, he represented the stability she'd been yearning for. "I think it's on the kitchen counter, honey," Grace called back to Lily, adjusting her dress one last time before stepping away from the mirror. Their modest 2-story house was filled with wedding preparations, sample centerpieces scattered across the dining table, color swatches pinned to the bulletin board, and wedding magazines stacked neatly on every surface. Robert had insisted on sparing no expense for the wedding. "You deserve the very best," he'd said, his blue eyes twinkling as he presented her with a stunning diamond engagement ring. He'd even offered to pay for Lily's college tuition, a gesture that had brought tears to Grace's eyes. Yet somehow it had only made Lily more withdrawn. Walking downstairs, Grace found Lily at the kitchen counter, absently flipping through her notebook. "Everything okay, sweetie?" she asked, noting the slight furrow in her daughter's brow. "Yeah, just thinking about the wedding," Lily replied, not quite meeting her mother's eyes. There was something in her tone that Grace couldn't quite place: hesitation, concern. But before she could probe further, her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Just closed another deal, beautiful. Taking you both out to celebrate tonight. Wear that blue dress I love." Grace smiled at the message, but noticed Lily watching her with an unreadable expression. Their dynamic had shifted since Robert entered their lives. Where they once shared everything, Lily had become increasingly reserved, especially when it came to discussions about her future stepfather. The wedding was 2 months away, and the preparations were moving full steam ahead. Robert had hired the most sought-after wedding planner in town, booked the luxurious Silver Lake Resort, and arranged for a string quartet to play during the ceremony. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, a small voice in the back of Grace's mind whispered, but she pushed the thought away. That evening, as they sat in the city's most exclusive restaurant, Robert regaled them with stories about his latest business venture. Grace watched him with admiration, while Lily pushed her food around her plate, her shoulders tense. When Robert excused himself to take a business call, Lily finally spoke up. "Mom, are you sure about all this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just seems fast." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know it's a big change, honey, but Robert makes me happy. Don't you want that for me?" Lily's response was interrupted by Robert's return, his million-dollar smile firmly in place as he suggested they order dessert. As he spoke about their honeymoon plans, Grace couldn't help but notice how Lily's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers tightening around her water glass. Later that night, after Robert had dropped them home with a kiss for Grace and a warm pat on the shoulder for Lily, Grace stood in their kitchen making tea. The house was quiet except for the soft sounds of Lily typing away on her laptop upstairs, probably working on her college applications, Grace assumed. Looking at the wedding invitation sample on the refrigerator, Grace felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. In just 2 months, she would be Mrs. Robert Wilson. Her life would change completely: a new house, a new family dynamic, a fresh start. Yet as she sipped her tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of their carefully planned future, something neither she nor Robert could control. What Grace didn't know was that upstairs, Lily wasn't working on college applications at all. Her screen was filled with something very different, something that would soon shatter their perfect world into a million pieces. But for now, Grace stood in her kitchen, holding onto her dreams of a perfect wedding, unaware that her daughter was about to become her unlikely savior. The first signs were subtle, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Lily sat cross-legged on her bed one evening, scrolling through Robert's business Facebook page while half listening to him chat with her mother downstairs. His latest post showed him at a property opening in Houston, dated just 3 days ago. But something wasn't right. She distinctly remembered him having dinner with them that very evening, telling stories about his meetings in Seattle. Just a scheduling mix-up with the social media team, he'd explained smoothly when she'd casually mentioned it at breakfast the next morning. You know how these things get posted late sometimes. His smile was perfectly pleasant, but Lily noticed how his fingers tightened slightly around his coffee mug. Her mother had jumped in, laughing. "Oh, honey, you're becoming quite the detective." But there was a hint of nervousness in her voice, as if she didn't want to acknowledge even the possibility of inconsistency in their perfect world. That evening, while helping her mother sort through wedding RSVPs in their cozy living room, Lily's mind wandered back to other small discrepancies she'd noticed. There was the time Robert claimed to be stuck in traffic during a rainstorm in the city, but the weather had been clear all day. Or how he'd mentioned growing up in Boston, then later referred to his high school years in Chicago. "Mom," Lily started carefully, arranging the response cards in neat piles, "has Robert ever told you about his high school days?" Her mother looked up from the seating chart she was working on. "Of course. He went to that prestigious private school in, well, I'm sure he mentioned where exactly." She waved her hand dismissively, but Lily caught the momentary confusion in her eyes. The next week, during another lavish dinner at an upscale restaurant, Robert's treat, as always, Lily watched him more closely. He was charming as ever, ordering in perfect French and entertaining them with stories about his latest development project. But when the waiter mentioned having worked at another high-end restaurant Robert claimed to frequent, he quickly changed the subject. Working on a school project about business success stories, Lily explained innocently one afternoon, sitting in Robert's sleek office while waiting for her mother to finish some wedding errands. "Would you mind if I looked up some articles about your early career?" "Of course not, sweetheart." He beamed, but she noticed how quickly he steered her toward the company's current press releases instead of any historical information. At home that night, Lily's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, diving deeper into public records. Robert's current company had only existed for 3 years, despite his claims of running it for over a decade. His LinkedIn profile was impressively detailed, but barely had any connections or engagement. It was as if his professional existence had materialized out of thin air. "He's just private about his online presence," her mother insisted when Lily tried to voice her concerns. "Not everyone lives their life on social media, honey." But there was a new tension in her voice, a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. The breaking point came during a weekend when Robert was supposedly at a real estate conference in Miami. Lily was helping her mother clean out some closets when they found a receipt that had fallen behind a drawer. It was from a coffee shop in Portland, dated the same day Robert had claimed to be giving a keynote speech in Florida. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," a mother said quickly, snatching the receipt away. But Lily saw the flash of doubt cross her face, quickly masked by a bright smile. "Let's focus on the wedding plans instead. What do you think about these flower arrangements?" That night, unable to sleep, Lily sat at her desk with a notebook, writing down everything that didn't add up. The inconsistent business history, the contradictory travel dates, the way he smoothly deflected personal questions, the mysterious phone calls he'd take in private, speaking in hushed tones. She started doing what any teenager would do. She Googled him. Different variations of his name, his company, his supposed past achievements. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, made her stomach churn. Before 3 years ago, Robert Wilson might as well have been a ghost. But it was his reaction to unexpected situations that truly set off alarm bells. Like when they ran into one of her mother's old clients at the mall, and he suddenly remembered an urgent phone call he had to make. Or how he always seemed to have a ready excuse for why his supposed business partners could never make it to dinner. The final straw came when Lily overheard him on the phone late one night, speaking in a tone she'd never heard before. Gone was the smooth, charming voice she'd grown used to. Instead, his words were sharp, calculating, almost threatening. "Make sure everything's moved offshore before the wedding," he'd said. "We can't risk any loose ends this time." As she lay in bed that night, Lily's mind raced. The wedding was just weeks away. Her mother was happier than she'd been in years, planning her dream wedding with a man who seemed too good to be true. And maybe that was exactly the problem. He was too perfect, too polished, too practiced. But how could she prove her suspicions? How could she protect her mother without concrete evidence? And most importantly, what if she was wrong? What if she was just being an overprotective daughter, resistant to change, unwilling to accept her mother's happiness? The answer came in the form of a small news article she found buried in an old newspaper archive. The face in the grey photo was younger, the name was different, but the eyes, those same calculating eyes, were unmistakably Robert's. The headline read, "Local businessman vanishes after investment scheme exposed." Lily closed her laptop slowly, her heart pounding. She had work to do and not much time to do it, because in just a few weeks, her mother was going to marry a man who wasn't at all who he claimed to be, unless Lily could find a way to stop it. The clock on Lily's laptop read 2:47 a.m. as she stared at her screen, her eyes burning from hours of research. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of her computer and the distant sound of crickets outside her window. What had started as simple suspicion had led her down a rabbit hole she never expected to find. "Just one more search," she whispered to herself, taking another sip of her now-cold tea. Her desk was covered in handwritten notes, each page filled with dates, locations, and questions that needed answers. The past week had been a blur of late-night investigating and bleary-eyed mornings, trying to act normal around Robert while carrying the weight of her growing discoveries. It started with a simple reverse image search of Robert's business headshot. The photo appeared on several different business websites, each time with a different name. Richard Warner in Seattle, Benjamin Clark in Miami, Thomas Hughes in Chicago. Each identity was carefully crafted, with its own business history and social media presence. During breakfast that morning, Robert had mentioned his childhood home in Boston again. "The old brownstone on Beacon Street," he'd said confidently, buttering his toast. "Spent my whole childhood there." But Lily had found property records showing that address hadn't been a residential building for over 30 years. It had been a bank. Her mother noticed her exhaustion at dinner. "Sweetie, are you getting enough sleep? You look tired." The concern in her voice made Lily's heart ache. How could she explain that she'd spent the previous night tracing financial records that showed a pattern of suspicious business dealings across multiple states? Using her computer skills from the coding classes she'd taken last summer, Lily had managed to piece together a disturbing pattern. In each city, the story was the same. A charismatic businessman would appear, charm his way into wealthy social circles, particularly targeting successful single mothers, then disappear just as investment deals were meant to close or joint accounts were established. One afternoon, while her mother was at work, Lily had sneaked a look at Robert's laptop when he left it briefly unattended during a visit. Her hands shook as she quickly photographed the screen showing multiple email accounts under different names. Each inbox contained correspondence with different women, all following a similar pattern to his relationship with her mother. The breakthrough came when she found an old newspaper article from Portland. A woman had lost her life savings to a man matching Robert's description, though under a different name. The article included a quote that made Lily's blood run cold. "He was so convincing, so caring. He even bonded with my teenage daughter. I never suspected a thing until it was too late." Lily created a detailed spreadsheet documenting everything she found. Bank records showing mysterious transfers to offshore accounts. Business licenses that appeared and disappeared within months. Social media profiles that seemed to age backward and forward depending on which identity he was using. One night, she overheard him on the phone in the backyard, speaking in hushed tones. "Everything's proceeding as planned. She has no idea. The accounts will be ready to transfer right after the wedding." The way he laughed made her skin crawl. It wasn't the warm chuckle her mother had fallen in love with, but something cold and calculated. Her hands trembled as she dug deeper into court records. 3 restraining orders from different states, all filed by women with similar stories. Investment schemes that left businesses bankrupt. A trail of broken promises and empty bank accounts stretching across the country. The most recent discovery was the most shocking. Hidden in his cloud storage, she found documents preparing to transfer her mother's entire retirement savings and their house deed to an account in the Cayman Islands. The transfer was scheduled for the day after the wedding. "Just looking out for our future together," he told her mother when convincing her to add his name to her accounts. "We're going to be family, after all." The memory of those words now made Lily feel sick. She'd also found emails to a realtor in another state, arranging for a quick sale of their family home right after the wedding. "The stepdaughter will be away at college," he'd written. "It'll be the perfect time to liquidate the property." Late one night, Lily heard her mother crying softly in her room. When she went to check on her, she found her looking at old photos of their life before Robert. "I just want you to be happy about this wedding," her mother had said, wiping away tears. "Why can't you give him a chance?" Those tears strengthened Lily's resolve. She began preparing a presentation, gathering every piece of evidence she'd collected. Screenshots, documents, bank records, newspaper articles, everything that proved Robert wasn't who he claimed to be. She organized it all chronologically, creating a clear timeline of his deceptions. The wedding was just days away. Lily knew she had to act soon, but the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Robert might find a way to explain it all away. Too late, and her mother would lose everything they'd worked so hard for. As she sat in her room that night, looking at the final piece of evidence, a current arrest warrant from Nevada under yet another alias, Lily made her decision. The wedding itself would be her moment. With all their friends and family as witnesses, she would expose Robert's true identity. It would be dramatic, public, and impossible to ignore. Her mother's happiness meant everything to her, and this would break her heart. But better a broken heart than a broken life. With trembling fingers, Lily began preparing her final presentation, knowing that in just a few days, she would either save her mother from the biggest mistake of her life or risk losing her trust forever. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, but Lily's stomach was in knots as she watched the sunrise from her bedroom window. The elegant Silver Lake resort was already buzzing with activity. Florists arranged white roses and lilies, caterers wheeled in carts of food, and the string quartet practiced softly in the garden. Her laptop bag felt heavy with the weight of everything she'd discovered. She'd triple-checked all her files last night, making sure every piece of evidence was ready. The presentation she'd prepared was saved in multiple formats. She couldn't risk any technical issues today of all days. "Sweetheart, are you ready?" her mother called from down the hall. "The hairstylist is here." Lily closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. Her mother's voice was filled with joy, completely unaware that her perfect day was about to shatter. In the bridal suite, watching her mother get ready, Lily's doubt crept in again. Her mother looked radiant in her cream-colored wedding dress, happiness glowing in her eyes as the makeup artist applied the finishing touches. Was Lily really going to ruin this moment? "You're quiet today," her mother said, catching Lily's reflection in the mirror. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just nervous about the big day." Lily managed to smile, but her hands were shaking as she helped arrange her mother's veil. The weight of her secret felt like it was crushing her chest. Through the window, she could see guests starting to arrive. Her Uncle Pete, a police officer, was helping direct cars in the parking lot. She'd made sure he would be seated near the front. She might need his help later. Robert arrived looking impeccable in his designer tuxedo, greeting guests with his trademark charm. But Lily noticed how his eyes kept darting toward her, watching her movements. During the rehearsal dinner last night, she'd caught him trying to peek at her phone screen. Had he sensed something was wrong? "The bride looks stunning," he'd said smoothly, stopping by the bridal suite. "And you clean up nice too, kiddo." His words were warm, but his eyes were cold as they locked with Lily's. For a moment, she saw something dangerous flash across his face. Time seemed to move in slow motion as the ceremony approached. Lily's hands were clammy as she helped her mother with last-minute details. The bouquet needed adjusting. A ribbon had come loose on one of the centerpieces. Small tasks to keep her mind occupied, to stop herself from screaming out the truth right then and there. 5 minutes until we start," the wedding planner announced, poking her head into the bridal suite. Lily excused herself, saying she needed to use the bathroom. Instead, she rushed to the venue's control room, where she'd earlier convinced the young tech guy to let her connect her laptop for a special surprise presentation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, double-checking all the connections. The projector was ready. The speakers were tested. Every denning piece of evidence was queued up and ready to go. Through the window, she could see Robert standing at the altar, looking perfectly composed. He was chatting with the minister, probably sharing another one of his made-up stories about his charitable work or his business success. Back in the bridal suite, her mother was taking deep breaths, ready to walk down the aisle. "How do I look?" she asked, turning to Lily with tears of joy in her eyes. "Beautiful, Mom," Lily whispered, hugging her tight. "I love you so much." She hoped her mother would remember those words later, when everything fell apart. The music started. Guests stood up. The bridesmaids began their procession. Lily's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear the string quartet over the rush of blood in her ears. As she took her place in the procession, clutching her bouquet, she saw Robert's confident smile. He had no idea what was coming. In his jacket pocket, she could see the edge of an envelope, probably plane tickets for the honeymoon he'd planned, a trip that would have ended with her mother penniless and alone. The minister began speaking, his words echoing through the decorated hall. Lily's laptop bag sat hidden behind a flower arrangement ready. Her Uncle Pete was alert in his seat, somehow sensing the tension in her posture. Through the stained glass windows, sunlight cast colorful patterns across the aisle. The scene looked perfect. The happy couple, the beautiful venue, the emotional guests. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Robert reached for her mother's hands, ready to recite his vows. Lily's fingers tightened around her bouquet. In just moments, the minister would ask if anyone had any reasons why this couple should not be joined in marriage. And Lily had more than just reasons. She had proof. The next few minutes would change everything. As she waited for her moment, Lily silently apologized to her mother for what she was about to do. Sometimes love meant causing pain to prevent an even greater heartbreak. The minister cleared his throat, preparing to speak those crucial words. Lily's hand moved toward her laptop bag, her heart racing. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same. The minister's voice echoed through the decorated hall. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." Lily's heart thundered in her chest as she stood up from her seat in the front row. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear and steady. "I have something everyone needs to see." The collective gasp from the wedding guests seemed to freeze time itself. Her mother's face paled, while Robert's confident smile flickered for just a moment before he recovered. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time for—" "Actually, it's exactly the time," Lily interrupted, her fingers already connecting her laptop to the venue's projection system. The large screen behind the altar flickered to life, and the string quartet fell silent. "Mom," Lily turned to face her mother directly. "I know you think I'm just being difficult about this wedding, but there's something you need to know about the man you're about to marry." The first image appeared on the screen, a police report from Nevada. Robert's face, under a different name, stared back at the shocked audience. "This man isn't Robert Wilson. That name didn't exist until 3 years ago." She clicked to the next slide. Banking records appeared, showing suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. "He's been planning to transfer all your savings the day after the wedding. Everything you've worked for, gone." Robert's charm vanished instantly. His eyes darkened as he took a step toward Lily, but her Uncle Pete was faster, moving to stand between them. The wedding guests murmured in confusion as more evidence appeared on the screen. In Seattle, he was Richard Warner. Lily continued, her voice growing stronger. "He convinced a widow to invest her life savings in a fake development project." Another click showed newspaper clippings. In Miami, as Benjamin Clark, he did the same thing to another single mother. Her mother sank into a nearby chair, the white of her wedding dress stuck against her pale face. "This can't be true," she whispered, but her eyes were fixed on the screen, taking in every detail. "I have proof of everything," Lily continued, bringing up more documents. "Multiple identities, fake businesses, stolen money. He's wanted in 3 states for fraud. She turned to Robert, who had gone completely still. "Would you like to explain the arrest warrant in Nevada, or should I?" The chaos that followed happened in rapid succession. Robert lunged forward, his composed facade completely shattered. "You little," he snarled, but Uncle Pete intercepted him, using his police training to block Robert's advance. "Don't move," Pete commanded, his off-duty weapon already drawn. Several other guests who were also law enforcement officers moved to assist, forming a barrier between Robert and the rest of the wedding party. Lali's mother stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she looked at the man she'd almost married. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was any of it real?" Robert's silence was all the confirmation she needed. The weight of betrayal crashed over her face as tears began to fall, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "Check his phone," Lally said, her voice tight with emotion. "You'll find messages about transferring everything offshore. Check his briefcase in the bridal suite. There are papers ready to sell our house." The wedding planner was already on the phone with the police, while guests watched in stunned silence as more evidence appeared on the screen. Years of deception laid bare in front of everyone. "You were supposed to be at your grandmother's next weekend," Robert spat at Lily, still restrained by Pete. "Everything was planned perfectly. How did you figure it out?" "You made mistakes," Lily replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "Small ones at first, dates that didn't match, stories that changed. Then I started digging. Real criminals keep better records than you, Robert, or whatever your real name is." Her mother moved to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The simple gesture meant everything: trust, protection, love. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you," she whispered to Lily. The sound of sirens grew closer. Robert's face twisted with rage as he realized everything was falling apart. He made one last desperate attempt to break free, but Pete and the other officers held firm. The screen now showed a slideshow of evidence: fake business licenses, altered photographs, falsified documents. Each image was another nail in the coffin of Robert's elaborate scheme. "The money," her mother suddenly remembered, panic in her voice. "He has access to my accounts." "Not anymore," Lily assured her. "I called the bank yesterday. They've frozen everything pending investigation. He can't touch a penny." The local police burst through the doors, quickly taking control of the situation. As they read Robert his rights, Lily finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding for weeks. The beautiful wedding had become a crime scene. Guests were being interviewed as potential witnesses. The cake sat forgotten, the flowers wilted in the chaos. But none of that mattered. What mattered was her mother, still in her wedding dress, holding her tight and whispering, "Thank you for saving me." What mattered was the truth, finally exposed in the light of day. As Robert was led away in handcuffs, still hurling threats and promises of revenge, Lily's mother turned to the shocked wedding guests. "I guess we won't be having a reception after all," she said, managing a weak smile through her tears. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Guests surrounded them with hugs, support, and promises to help however they could. In the face of devastating betrayal, they'd found themselves wrapped in a cocoon of love and protection from their true family and friends. The next hour at Silver Lake Resort was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Police cars lined the elegant driveway where luxury vehicles had been parked just moments before. The string quartet had packed up their instruments, leaving their chairs empty beside the flower-covered arch where a wedding was supposed to have taken place. Inside the grand hall, Detective Brown was taking statements from shocked guests while uniformed officers collected evidence. Lily sat with her mother in a quiet corner, both still in their wedding attire, as reality slowly sank in. "I need all guests to remain in the main hall," an officer announced, his voice carrying over the murmured conversations. "We'll need statements from everyone who witnessed the events or had any interaction with the suspect." The wedding planner, still clutching her clipboard, looked completely lost. Should I tell the caterers to start serving?" She asked no one in particular, her carefully planned timeline now meaningless. Uncle Pete, who had helped restrain Robert, was giving his official statement. As soon as the evidence appeared on screen, his whole demeanor changed. He explained to the detective. "It was like watching a mask fall off. The man we thought we knew just disappeared." In the bridal suite, now being searched by police, officers discovered a briefcase containing multiple passports under different names, each featuring Robert's photograph. There were also documents ready to transfer property deeds, bank accounts, and investment portfolios. Mrs. Henderson. A young officer approached Lily's mother gently. "We found these in his car." He held up a folder containing plane tickets to the Cayman Islands, one-way tickets, dated for the day after the honeymoon was supposed to end. Only one ticket had a return flight booked. The caterers, unsure what to do, had started serving appetizers to the waiting guests. The absurd sight of people in formal wear giving police statements while holding tiny quiches would have been funny under different circumstances. "I just can't believe it," Mrs. Davis, her mother's best friend, said while dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. "He seemed so perfect. Remember how he insisted on paying for Tommy's college application fees when I mentioned I was struggling? He was building trust," Lily explained, her voice tired but steady, "making everyone believe he was generous and caring. It was all part of his plan." The evidence on Lily's laptop had launched immediate investigations in 3 states. Detective Brown's phone kept ringing as more law enforcement agencies learned about Robert's capture. "We've got reports coming in from Seattle, Miami, and now Chicago," he told his partner. "This guy's been busy." In the kitchen, the wedding cake stood forgotten, its white frosting pristine and untouched. The cake topper, a bride and groom, had fallen over, as if symbolizing the day's events. "I should have seen it," Lily's mother whispered, staring at her engagement ring. "All those little things that didn't quite add up. I wanted so badly to believe in this perfect new life he was promising." Lily squeezed her mother's hand. "He was good at what he did, Mom. Really good. That's how he got away with it for so long." The hotel staff had started turning on more lights as evening approached. Nobody had planned for the event to run this late, but the police investigation showed no signs of wrapping up soon. "The suspect is requesting to speak with you," an officer informed them. "He claims he can explain everything." "There's nothing to explain," Lily's mother replied, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. "Tell him he can explain it to the judge." More revelations kept coming. The hotel's security team found a hidden laptop in Robert's car containing files on other potential targets, all successful single mothers with significant assets. Detective Brown called it a target list, his face grim as he added it to the growing pile of evidence. Uncle Pete had organized some of the other guests to form a protective circle around Lily and her mother, shielding them from prying eyes and whispered conversations. The support of their real friends and family stood in stark contrast to Robert's false affections. "Your daughter saved you from losing everything," Detective Brown told Lily's mother as he reviewed the financial documents. "The level of detail in his plan. He would have disappeared with your entire life savings within 24 hours of saying 'I do.'" Young police officer who had been examining Robert's phone approached with new information. "We found messages to accomplices," she reported. "This wasn't a one-man operation. He had people helping him set up fake businesses, create false documents." The weight of how close they'd come to disaster hit Lily's mother all at once. Her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Lily held her tightly, their tears mixing with the remnants of their carefully applied makeup. "I need some air," her mother said suddenly, standing up. They walked together to the resort's garden, where white chairs still stood in neat rows, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a beautiful ending to an awful day. In the distance, they could see police cars escorting Robert away, his perfectly tailored tuxedo now wrinkled from his failed escape attempt. "What do we do now?" her mother asked softly, looking at the ruins of what should have been her perfect day. Lily looked at her mother, seeing not defeat but strength in her eyes. "We go home," she said simply. "We order pizza, change into pajamas, and we start over. Together." A small smile appeared on her mother's face, tired but genuine. "Pizza sounds perfect," she said, squeezing Lily's hand. "And tomorrow, we'll deal with everything else." As they walked back inside, guests were finally being allowed to leave after giving their statements. Each one stopped to hug them, offering support, love, and promises to help however they could. The day hadn't turned out anything like they planned. But as Lily watched her mother thank their friends and family for their support, she knew they would be okay. Sometimes the happiest endings come from preventing the wrong one from happening. 3 months after the wedding that never was, life had taken on a new rhythm. The Henderson house, once filled with wedding preparations, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. The living room wall, which had displayed seating charts and color swatches, now held a large board covered with newspaper clippings and thank you notes from other women who had almost fallen victim to Robert's schemes. Another letter came today. Lily called out, walking through the front door after school. She found her mother in the kitchen, trying out a new cookie recipe. The house smelled like vanilla and chocolate, comfort scents that had replaced the lingering sadness. Her mother wiped her hands on a dish towel and took the envelope. Where from this time? Chicago. Apparently, the police there used our case to prevent him from targeting a single mom who owns a successful chain of bakeries. Lily dropped her backpack on a kitchen chair. They caught one of his accomplices trying to set up the same scam. The investigation had snowballed in ways nobody expected. Robert's arrest had uncovered a sophisticated network of fraudsters targeting successful single parents across the country. Detective Brown still called weekly with updates about new cases being solved thanks to the evidence Lily had gathered. The prosecutor called this morning, her mother said, sliding a plate of warm cookies across the counter. They're offering a plea deal, but Robert's refusing it. He still thinks he can charm his way out of this. Lily snorted. Good luck with that. The evidence is pretty solid. The healing process hadn't been easy. There were nights when Lily would hear her mother crying softly in her room, mourning not just Robert's betrayal, but the dream of what could have been. But there were also moments of unexpected joy, like when they turned the cancelled honeymoon trip into a mother-daughter vacation to the beach. Mrs. Chen from the real estate office stopped by today, her mother said, sitting down beside Lily. They want me to become a partner in the firm. Said my instincts for spotting suspicious deals have become invaluable. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The experience had changed how her mother approached everything in her life, especially her work. She'd even started offering free seminars to help others recognize the warning signs of financial fraud. Uncle Pate had introduced them to a financial advisor who specialized in helping fraud victims rebuild their lives. Thanks to Lily's quick action, they hadn't lost any money, but the advice about protecting their assets proved invaluable. Oh, I almost forgot. Lily pulled out her phone. Remember that article I wrote for the school newspaper about recognizing online scams? The local paper wants to publish it. They're doing a whole series on protecting yourself from fraud. Her mother beamed with pride. My daughter, the investigative journalist. The term had become a running joke between them, but there was truth in it. Lily's experience had sparked a passion for investigating and exposing truth. The doorbell rang, and they heard familiar voices. Their weekly dinner guests had arrived early. Mrs. Davis and several other friends had started a tradition of regular gatherings, refusing to let mother and daughter withdraw into isolation after everything that happened. We brought Italian. Mrs. Davis called out, letting herself in with the spare key. And wait until you hear what we found out about that new dating service in town. Something seemed fishy, so we did some digging, just like you taught us. The kitchen quickly filled with chatter and laughter as more friends arrived. These weekly dinners had become a sort of informal support group where they shared stories, warnings, and sometimes just the comfort of being with people who understood. Later that evening, after their friends had left, Lily found her mother sitting on the back porch, looking at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling into the chair next to her. "I was just thinking about how different everything turned out," her mother replied, wrapping an arm around Lily's shoulders. "Not just from what I planned, but from what I thought I wanted. Does that make sense?" Lily nodded. She understood perfectly. The dream of a perfect wedding and instant family had been replaced by something more real, a stronger bond with her mother, deeper friendships, and a new purpose in helping others. The defense lawyer called again, her mother continued. "Offered to drop the charges if we agreed to stay quiet about everything. Can you believe that? What did you tell him?" "I said we don't make deals with fraudsters." Her mother's voice was firm. "Our story has helped too many people. That's worth more than any plea bargain." Inside the house, Lily's laptop screen showed her latest project, a website designed to help people share their stories and recognize the warning signs of romance scams. It had started as a school assignment, but had grown into something bigger, with support from local law enforcement and advocacy groups. "You know what's funny?" Lily said, looking at her mother. "He thought he was so clever, targeting single moms, but he didn't understand that's exactly why he failed. He didn't realize how strong we already were." Her mother smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We were strong. We are strong. And now we're even stronger." The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from their garden. The flowers had been meant for the wedding, but instead of removing them, they decided to let them grow wild and free, much like their own lives had done. "Ready to go in?" her mother asked after a while. "I think we still got some of those cookies left." Lily stood up, helping her mother to her feet. "You know what this calls for? Our special hot chocolate with extra marshmallows." As they walked back into their warm, cozy house, Lily thought about how their story had changed from one of deception to one of triumph. The wedding that never happened had given them something far more valuable than a perfect day. It had given them their truth, their strength, and a new purpose. The investigation was still ongoing, with new developments every week. But that wasn't the real story anymore. The real story was about a mother and daughter who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, about a community that had rallied around them, and about how sometimes the best endings come from stopping the wrong one just in time.